She had always been quiet as a shadow when she wished to be. Long before she knew the faces she would don, the mantras she would learn, and the truths she would face, Arya Stark learned stealth in the twisting corridors of Winterfell. Sometimes she was just a curious child, eager to evade Septa Mordaine's lessons or Ned Stark's patient gaze, but her ability to walk silently had grown into a practiced art by the time she first left the North. After everything that had happened, her time in King's Landing, her journey through the Riverlands, her training in Bravos, Arya understood the power of invisibility more deeply than most. And now, as darkness hung over the world, this gift of silent movement was about to become the pivot upon which fate itself might turn. She crouched in the gloom behind a crumbling rise in the terrain just north of the last hearth. Along the horizon, skeletal silhouettes of the White Walker's vanguard drifted in the ghostly light of a full moon. No mortal watchers stood guard this far beyond the protective walls of Winterfell because no living man would willingly linger so close to the unstoppable legion from the lands of always winter. Yet Arya Stark was no ordinary watcher. She had come alone, ignoring the pleas of her sister Sansa and the orders of her brother-cousin Jon, determined to gather intelligence on the Night King's army. She had told herself it was to see, to learn, and then to slip away again. What she found instead was a chance, a mad, desperate chance that might turn the tide before the final onslaught truly began. Where the moonlight caught the ice crystals in the air, a bitter wind carried with it the rattling moans of wights and the low groaning scrape of dead men's armor. The others moved in near silence, but their dominion of cold made itself heard in the rustle of dead branches and the crackle of frost forming on living trees. Arya felt her breath crystallize in front of her as she peeked above the rocks. With eyes trained to see even the smallest detail, she caught sight of a lone figure standing above the mass of wights and White Walkers. He was tall, gaunt-faced, inhuman in every aspect, and wearing a crown of ice. His dark armor reflected no moonlight, it seemed to devour it, a void through which no warmth or mercy could pass. The Night King. Even in the open air, Arya thought she could hear the hush of all living things cower. She had never been this close to him before. She had not intended to go so far. The plan was to observe from a distance, measure the speed at which the army marched, and return to Winterfell by dawn. But she had come upon them more quickly than she expected, and in the hush of night, perched behind a half-toppled boulder, Arya realized she was terrifyingly close. Her heart hammered. She clenched the hilt of the Valyrian steel dagger strapped to her side. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, "Fear cuts deeper than swords." And then, more recently, she recalled her training with the Faceless Men, the repeated lessons from the kindly man in the House of Black and White. All men are mortal. All men can die. She thought of the shapeless question that had haunted her since she first saw the Night King. Was this thing truly a man, or something else that could not be killed by any ordinary means? Samwell Tarly had discovered that dragonglass and Valyrian steel had the power to destroy White Walkers, but to kill the Night King himself? Only prophecy and rumor swirled among them. Arya had never heard a certainty, only that it must be done. The entire fate of Westeros depended on it. To her horror and her astonishment, she suddenly saw an opening. The Night King had dismounted his undead steed. Viserions' monstrous, rotting shape lurked further off, blowing freezing gusts across the ground. The White Walkers and their wights surged onward, but for a brief moment, the Night King himself stood behind them, accompanied by only 2 of his lieutenants. He did not stride like a man who feared anything. Why should he? He believed himself unstoppable, an ancient force destined to drown the world in endless night. And in that arrogance, there was a gap. The area behind him was momentarily unguarded. Arya felt the cold sear her lungs as she inhaled and dared to creep closer. If she could just approach him from behind, unseen, perhaps. Her feet glided across the frozen earth as if she were crossing polished marble in the halls of the Red Keep. Though the memory of King's Landing felt like another life, her training remained. She reached a stand of dead, twisted trees, each one blackened by the creeping frost that signaled the White Walker's presence. Wights clambered onward. They stumbled here and there, but none looked back. Even the towering White Walkers who soared above the wights kept their empty gazes trained on the road ahead. The Night King, for his part, remained still as a statue of ice. Arya's heart thundered. They would sense her at any moment, she was sure. But they didn't. She wove around the trees, sinking into the gloom, each step timed with the moan of the wind. When the lieutenant on the Night King's right turned his head abruptly, she froze behind a trunk. That White Walker's strange, Crystalline eyes gleamed in the moonlight. She dared not breathe, dared not blink. She had no illusions about her chances if they discovered her. But the White Walker turned away, perceiving no threat. The living had retreated behind the walls of Winterfell, to wait and face certain doom at dawn or the next night or the next. They did not suspect a single woman, no matter how skilled, to be lurking a hand's breadth away. She slid around once more and saw the Night King's back. There it was. That cold, ridged armor patterned like the bark of winter trees, the edges rimed in frost. Her hand slowly moved to the dagger at her belt. The same dagger that had been meant to kill Bran Stark all those years ago in his bed. How many times had it changed hands? How many destinies had it shaped? In the end, it had found its way to Arya. Now it might change the fate of the world. She inhaled, or tried to, for the cold seemed to seize her lungs. Her body tensed like a drawn bow. She let out the most silent breath she had ever exhaled. Then, letting all her fear melt into a single fluid motion, she burst forward. At once, she felt the crackle of power in the air as if the Night King's presence alone carried its own storm. Her legs pistoned, her footsteps light even in the charged silence. She thought of every lesson Syrio Farrell ever taught her. Swift as a deer, quiet as a shadow, fear cuts deeper than swords. The girl is no one, the girl is Arya Stark. Her arms extended, dagger in hand. She closed the final gap in a heartbeat, for it had to be so fast that even his preternatural senses could not react in time. She aimed for the place where the armor parted at the back of his neck. He turned. She saw his unnatural, crystalline gaze over his shoulder an instant before her dagger struck. He was impossibly fast, his hand came up to block. But Arya twisted her wrist, the same trick she had used before, letting the blade fall into her other hand. For a moment, she swore the entire world hung in stasis, as if the wind itself paused to watch. Then the blade sank into the space between the ridges of his armor and found its mark. Arya had imagined the kill 100 times. She'd thought perhaps he would burst into shards of ice like the other White Walkers. But the Night King was no mere walker. The sound he made was a deep, eldritch groan vibrating in the air. Then cracks began to spiderweb across his form. His ancient face, carved in an expression that had never known fear or pain, contorted. Ice split. A blast of frigid air exploded from him, knocking Arya backwards. She tumbled, lost her footing, and slammed into the frozen ground. She regained her senses just in time to see the Night King dissolving into splinters of ice that glowed pale blue in the moonlight. A swirl of freezing fog spread outward, enveloping the two White Walker lieutenants. They let loose piercing shrieks of rage or anguish Arya could not tell. Both shattered in a heartbeat, swirling into glimmering frost that the wind carried away in a violent gust. Then came the silence. Even the moans of the Whites halted. Arya's head rang, her body ached, but she struggled to her knees, peering at the army that had, only moments before, seemed unstoppable. Thousands of dead men, women, and beasts stood rigid and still under that moonlit sky. Then one by one, they began to collapse. Like puppets with their strings severed, they fell into heaps. Bones and rotted flesh turned to dust. Armored corpses dissolved. The stench of death and the swirl of fine grayish matter filled the air. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the slow, deep breath that Arya forced herself to take as she tried to believe what she was seeing. She had done it, she had killed the Night King. And with him, the entire undead army had collapsed. She knelt on the frozen earth, chest heaving as the magnitude of it sank in. The distant roar that had been the Whites, the White Walkers, the nearing apocalypse gone. Only the hiss of the wind through lifeless branches remained. Her dagger lay on the ground a few feet away, glimmering with the faint light of runes that quickly faded. She crawled to retrieve it, hand shaking, still disbelieving that it could really be over. She half expected a monstrous shape to emerge from the swirling dust or a fresh legion of dead to rise from the snow. But nothing happened. She was alone. Alone and alive in a moment she had not even dared to think possible. She had won. It felt as if hours passed while she stared over the field of the dead, which was now nothing but drifting piles of dust and broken weapons. The sky above seemed too vast, too uncaring, as if the heavens had not realized that the end of the world had just come and gone. She watched the swirl of dust catch in the moonbeams, drifting away on the wind, the final remains of an ancient threat. Then, with trembling legs, Arya climbed to her feet. She tested her left arm, wincing at a bruise forming on her shoulder. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving her body shaky, exhausted. But a bubble of laughter threatened to escape her lips. She had done it. She remembered the night in the Godwood when Melisandre asked her what they said to the god of death. Not today. Indeed, not today. Yet she could not linger. She had to return to Winterfell and tell them. Word of the Night King's demise would never travel quickly if she just stood here. She let out a quivering breath, glanced at the empty field one last time, and then turned south. If her journey north had been hurried, her return was near frantic. Every part of her wanted to race across the plains and announce the victory at once, but she knew to keep her stealth. She imagined stray patrols of whites, wandering pockets that might remain even with the Night King gone. But the hush of the land suggested there was nothing left, no necromantic puppet strings animating corpses. Still, caution had kept her alive this long, and she wouldn't throw it away now. She was nearly delirious by the time she saw the familiar outlines of Winterfell's walls rising from the darkness. Already in the distant blackness behind her, a faint glow on the horizon hinted at dawn. She approached the gates as a lone figure, face streaked with cold sweat, her garments stiff with frost. At first, the guards did not recognize her. One of them shouted, "Halt, who goes there?" She struggled for the breath to speak. "Arya Stark." That was enough. They opened the gates with a cry of astonishment, and soon she was inside the courtyard, dragging her feet across the muddy ground. Sansa was there, hair pulled back in a rushed braid, eyes wide. Jon, his face grimy with soot and worry, stepped forward. Brienne, Podrick, Gendry, Daenerys, Grey Worm faces emerged from the gloom one by one. Arya saw the flickering torchlight across their expressions. They looked terrified that she was alone. They had expected the army of the dead at any moment, streaming in behind her. But there was no pursuit. "Arya?" Jon breathed. "What, how?" She swallowed, her throat raw, and she forced out the words, "The Night King, he's dead." No one spoke. Sansa's brow furrowed. Daenerys' eyes flickered from wariness to confusion, and Jon took a slow step forward. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, as if speaking to a wounded child. "He's dead." Arya managed a nod. "I killed him. He was north of the last hearth. He dismounted from Viserion, and there was a chance, so I took it." Her lips trembled. "They're gone. His whole army gone." She saw the disbelief on their faces. She had barely believed it herself. Then she repeated, with a touch more force. They all collapsed into dust. "The White Walkers, everything. You won't see them here. They won't be coming." Chaos erupted as the words sank in. People shouted. Some demanded details, others simply gaped. Jon placed his hands on her shoulders as if to verify she was real. "Show me," he whispered. But of course, there was nothing to show except the Valyrian dagger and the memory. The courtyard burst into movement as more of the defenders rushed in, their morale at the brink of panic until they learned the truth. Daenerys demanded they send out scouts, and Grey Worm quickly dispatched men on horses to verify the land to the north. A stunned hush overtook the atmosphere as they realized that, for the moment, the threat of the dead, this unstoppable force they had all united to fight, might truly have vanished overnight. Despite the flurry of excitement, someone draped a cloak over Arya's shoulders and guided her into the great hall, where she was urged to sit near the fire. Her limbs shook from cold and exhaustion. Hot wine was pressed into her hands, and she drank greedily, ignoring the burn. Sansa hovered near her, pale-faced, looking as though she wanted to scold her sister for leaving on such a suicidal mission, but too overwhelmed by what Arya had accomplished to speak. Jon hovered as well, anxiety and awe warring in his eyes. Daenerys stood a short distance away, turning her head to glance at the hall's open doors, as though expecting more news. Within the hour, reports from the scouts streamed back. They had ventured far enough north to reach the location Arya described, and indeed, found piles of crumbling equipment and no sign of movement. Not a single white, not a White Walker, no sign of the Night King or his monstrous dragon. The air still clung with an unnatural chill, but the threat was gone. Word spread through Winterfell like wildfire. Men and women who had huddled in the crypts or along the battlements preparing for death and destruction were suddenly faced with the impossible prospect that they had already won, thanks to one young woman with a dagger. The shock gave way to jubilation, though it was not immediate. Many still feared that this was a trick, some cunning ploy of the Night King to lull them into lowering their guard. Yet as the hours passed, and no undead force materialized, hope began to blossom. Soldiers who had expected to die that night found themselves instead celebrating in hushed voices. The relief felt enormous, like a pressure lifting from their chests. Many fell to their knees in thanks to the old gods and the new. Others roared with laughter or sobbed uncontrollably. And at the center of it all was Arya Stark, sitting by the hearth, still somewhat numb. Gendry approached, kneeling before her, eyes brimming with gratitude and something else she couldn't name. But she was too tired to say anything. She simply grabbed his hand and gave it a squeeze. He squeezed back as if to say, "We are alive." When at last the relief and wonder started to settle into some manageable shape, Jon insisted they gather in the great hall to plan their next step. At the high table, Arya found herself uncomfortably at the center of attention. Her sister Sansa presided with a regal air. Daenerys sat with shoulders squared, as though she was still prepared for an enemy to strike, and Jon tried to keep the conversation organized. On either side, the northern lords and advisors from the Targaryen camp jostled for details. "How can you be certain there won't be other pockets of the dead?" asked Davos Seaworth, pressing his palms flat on the table. Arya, with a nod of thanks for the second mug of hot wine she'd been handed, said, "I saw them shatter. Not just that, but they collapsed all around him. When the Night King died, the entire army fell. He was their link to life." She paused and tried to put it into words. "It was like cutting the head off a snake. The body can't move if the head's gone." Grey Worm, voice clipped and cautious, asked, "But the dragon? We've had no sighting of the undead dragon since." Jon answered him, "Our scouts say they saw what looked like a massive scattering of icy remains. But it could have been Viserion. They said they found bones frozen to the ground. If that was the Night King's mount, it must have collapsed and crumbled like the rest." Daenerys's expression turned sorrowful for a moment, recalling that Viserion had been one of her children. She swallowed hard. "And the White Walkers themselves? All gone, they say," Jon replied, glancing at Arya. "When the Night King shattered, so did they." The hall was hushed. The tension that still lingered in the aftermath of such an unexpected victory crackled. They were not used to relief. They had prepared for a last stand, believing it might well be the end of everything. Now the question loomed, what would they do now that they had survived? That evening, after restless attempts to sleep, Arya found herself awake, pacing the ramparts of Winterfell. She stared out across the snow-covered fields, imagining the tide of whites that was supposed to come. She remembered the hush of the House of Black and White, the endless training in stealth, the close calls and bravos. She remembered Gendry forging dragon-glass weapons in the winter gloom, the uncertain gloom on Sansa's face as they prepared for the worst. The worst was behind them, apparently, and she was still here. Life felt strangely fragile, as though she could blink and discover this was all a fever dream. Soft footsteps approached. She turned to see Jon, who joined her at the rampart. For a moment, they said nothing, gazing at the northern sky. "I should be thanking you," Jon said quietly at last. "We all should." Arya shrugged, though her heart was heavy with emotion. "You know I don't like compliments. There was a chance. I took it. It was that or let them march to Winterfell. If I'd failed, I'd be dead." Her brow creased. "Maybe if I'd failed, the dead would be here by now. But I got lucky." Jon's smile was tinged with awe. "Luck and skill, I'd say. Arya, you saved us all." She turned her head, looking at him in the low torchlight. "Then let's make sure we don't waste the second chance." Jon nodded. He placed a hand on the hilt of Longclaw. "Aye, we have to decide what comes next. Daenerys still wants to push south and claim the Iron Throne. Cersei has not offered any aid, as we know. We were bracing for a war on two fronts. Now it's a war for the throne. And Cersei won't believe this until we knock on her door." Arya pursed her lips. A part of her still felt the burning desire to avenge her family, to cross names off her list. Cersei's name had been there for a very long time. The dead are gone, so we have no reason to stay here waiting for an attack. She left the rest unsaid. They both knew what was implied. The living can turn their knives on each other once more. He rubbed a hand across his face. "Let's hope it doesn't come to more bloodshed than necessary," he muttered, though Arya sensed he knew better. Daenerys was determined. Cersei was entrenched in her power. War seemed inevitable, but at least the war would be among living men and women, a conflict that had some spark of hope. It was not the cosmic oblivion of an undead horde. That night, Winterfell glowed with torchlight and the beginnings of subdued celebration. Though many were simply in shock and too exhausted to celebrate, the relief was unmistakable. It seeped into the corridors, into the great hall, where wine was poured more freely, and the kitchens worked overtime to feed a host that was expecting to fight for their lives. People who had huddled close to the hearths, awaiting the horns that would announce the dead, now found themselves telling stories instead. Whispers of the girl with the dagger spread among the common folk. They gawked at her from a distance, or murmured about how quiet she was, how impossible it seemed that she had ended the threat that even dragons couldn't fully halt. Word reached the troops from the Vale, the Riverlands, the Crownlands, who had come north to help. Some began packing up, confused about what was next. Others broke out in uproarious laughter, arms slung around one another, weeping tears of relief. The greatest war that had ever threatened humanity was over, snuffed out in a single stroke of Valyrian steel. Tormund Giantsbane lamented that there was no grand battle for them to prove their mettle. The Hound retreated to the shadows of the courtyard, scowling at the entire affair, though occasionally his gaze flitted to Arya with grudging respect. In the following days, more scouts confirmed that the north was free of whites. Villagers in the outlying settlements breathed a collective sigh of relief, though they had heard horrifying rumors and many had fled to Winterfell for safety. Now they could return and find their homes intact. Lords who had once refused to join the fight arrived to confirm the rumor themselves. All around, Arya was lauded as a hero. It unsettled her more than she would admit. She who had chosen the face of no one, who had tried to become death incarnate, was now being treated like a savior. Some even started calling her the Night Slayer, though she winced at the grandiose tone. Sansa tried to shield her from most of the attention, but there was only so much she could do. Eventually, Arya retreated to the training yard. There, she practiced with a wooden sword, running through the drills Syrio Farrell had taught her, repeating them again and again until the world narrowed to muscle memory, sweat, and breath. She tried not to think about what it meant to have ended the greatest threat to Westeros. She was still the same Arya, wasn't she? She tried to pretend that her life would continue as it had. But that was impossible. There were eyes upon her, and the rest of the realm would want things from her now. She had shaped history in a single blow. On the 10th morning after the night of the kill, Jon and Daenerys summoned the Northern Lords and their allies for a council in the Great Hall. Arya attended only reluctantly, but Sansa insisted. The hall was full of tension. Without the existential threat of the dead, old grievances and alliances began to rear their heads. Lords from the Westerlands who had sworn to help men who had broken from the Lannisters now seemed uncertain. House Glover, who had left Winterfell earlier, returned with apologies. The question of Southern loyalty loomed. At the high table, Daenerys and Jon stood side by side. Tyrion was on Daenerys's right, face impassive, as though carefully watching every reaction. Varys lingered in the background, hands folded in front of him. "We have defeated the Night King," Daenerys said. "Thanks to Arya Stark, Westeros is safe from the dead. Now we must address the living threats that remain." Cersei Lannister sits the Iron Throne, holding the capital in her grasp, having broken every promise of alliance she made. She's an unjust ruler who will continue to sow discord. The rightful heir, she paused, glancing at Jon, the rightful heir or heirs should take her place and establish peace in the realm. A ripple of murmurs went through the hall. Some nodded in agreement. Others eyed Daenerys warily, remembering her Targaryen lineage and the legends of her father's madness. Sansa's cool gaze flicked over the lords. Bran sat quietly to the side, a distant expression on his face. Arya noticed how he seemed only half present, as if he lived in some larger tapestry of existence. Jon spoke then, voice steady. "I understand many of you followed me north because I asked, because we believed the threat was real. Now that threat is gone, thanks to my sister. We have a chance to remake the realm. But that chance requires unity." He exhaled. "If you believe the North should remain independent, I can't blame you for that. I've seen what rulers in the South have done to us. But Daenerys Targaryen has risked her life and her dragons to save the realm from the dead. She didn't wait until the army of the dead was at her doorstep. She came north. We should at least consider that alliance as we move south to remove Cersei." Sansa lifted her chin. "My brother speaks truly. But the North has bled enough. We lost countless men and women preparing for this war. We do not wish to lose more in a southern conflict. If we are to support Daenerys Targaryen's claim, we need assurances." Daenerys nodded respectfully to Sansa. "I understand your concern," she replied. "You want to protect the North. As Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, I vow that the North will have a say in matters of governance. And if the North chooses to remain outside the realm, that is something we can discuss once the Iron Throne is secured and Cersei's tyranny ended." Sansa did not immediately reply. but the tension in her posture eased slightly. Davos Seaworth spoke up, citing the necessity of removing Cersei before she attacks the north once more. Tyrion framed the advantages of a swift strike with unified forces. The gathering continued for hours, hashing out details, forging pacts between lords who had arrived with their men. Arya watched from the sidelines. This was the realm she had saved. Fractious, complicated, full of political maneuvering. She tried to focus on the bigger picture. The war with the dead, the one that truly mattered, was over. Now the living had to decide their future. For the time being, that meant going south to settle the score with Cersei. Arya felt an odd swirl of excitement and dread at the thought. Cersei's name was on her list. That old vow still burned in her chest. She had never forgotten what the Lannisters did to her family. Never forgotten the moment she had witnessed her father's execution. She had once told the Hound that she planned to kill Queen Cersei. Now, ironically, she was the one to end the Night King. Would she also be the one to end the last Lannister threat? But the voice of the faceless men inside her cautioned that vengeance was not the same as duty. She had to choose carefully what she did next. In the subsequent days, preparations began for a southern campaign. Winterfell bustled with renewed energy, as blacksmiths hammered away at swords and men refletched arrows. Though some recommended rest after their near-apocalyptic ordeal, Daenerys insisted that Cersei might strike while they were still gathering themselves. Time was of the essence. Word of the Night King's death spread across Westeros. The small folk received these rumors with wild hope or disbelief. Some believed it an elaborate hoax to draw them into the Targaryen cause. Others believed wholeheartedly that the end of the world had been narrowly averted. Meanwhile, Daenerys attempted to rally her 2 living dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, to practice flights near Winterfell. A creeping sorrow lingered whenever she saw the empty space where Viserion once flew, but she forced herself onward. It was an odd sight, the dragons circling in the sky not to fight the undead but as a show of strength. Some men in the yard gaped. They had never seen a dragon in flight until recently. Arya, standing near the gates, watched as Rhaegal soared overhead, thinking of how quickly the greatest threat had come and gone. She wondered if the world would look back on the Night King's attempt as a minor footnote, overshadowed by the politics that followed. She hoped not. She hoped people would remember what almost happened. But men often forgot warnings once the immediate danger passed. On the eve of departure, a feast was held in Winterfell's hall. It was not the dour, tension-filled gathering from before. This time there was mead, ale, and wine, roasted boar and game from the surrounding forests. Stories were traded, not just of the knights to come but of the living. Even the free folk who had fought bravely at the wall joined in. Tormund roared with laughter, boasting of feats that never got a chance to be tested in the big battle. The Hound grunted at compliments thrown Arya's way, but in his silence there was a strange camaraderie. Gendry found moments to stand at Arya's side, letting her know without words how grateful he was that she had returned alive and victorious. In that swirl of warmth and relief, Daenerys rose at the high table and lifted her goblet. She made a speech about unity and gratitude, praising the bravery of the North and everyone who had come to fight the great evil. She named Arya Stark the hero of Winterfell, which made Arya cringe. But she recognized it was Daenerys' way of honoring the deed. The hall erupted in cheers, though Sansa's face was reserved and Bran's expression distant. Jon clapped her on the shoulder, a grin momentarily lighting his face. Arya inclined her head in thanks. She sat there quietly, feeling the collective glow, but her mind flickered with other images, the swirling dust that had been the Night King, the illusions that might come from power and attention. She had never wanted to be lauded as a hero. She had only done what needed to be done. When the applause died down, she slipped away from the high table, letting the rest of them make their toasts to the living and to the future. She found herself out in the courtyard again, breathing in the night air, her cloak drawn tight. Sansa approached. "You're missing your own celebration," Sansa said, a small smile curving her lips. Arya shrugged, returning the smile faintly. "The last time everyone celebrated after a great victory, I still didn't fit in. Remember after we took back Winterfell?" Sansa nodded. "I remember. But this is different. You've saved the world from the army of the dead. That's more than any of us could have hoped." She studied Arya's face. "Thank you. For doing what you did. For taking that risk." Arya hesitated. She saw in her sister's eyes a depth of gratitude that words couldn't convey. They had survived so much, lost their parents, lost their home, endured betrayals and horrors. Now they had come out the other side with the greatest threat gone before it could devour them. Arya's gaze dropped. "I'm sorry I worried you," she said softly. "Apology accepted," Sansa replied. "Just don't do it again." A wry grin tugged at Arya's lips. "No promises." The tension broke into gentle laughter, and for a brief moment they were children again, huddled in Winterfell's courtyard, the wind biting at their cheeks. Only now their father was gone, their mother was gone, but they had each other. It was the closest to a moment of real peace Arya had felt in a very long time. Come the next sunrise, the host began to prepare to march south. Daenerys ordered the Unsullied to form the vanguard with the Dothraki, those who had survived the earlier clashes with the Whites in the open field, riding alongside. Northern bannermen and knights from various regions formed separate battalions. Jon spent hours discussing strategy with Daenerys, Tyrion, and the others. They planned to approach the Trident first, reassembling their forces near Riverrun, then push down the King's Road toward King's Landing. Ravens were sent out to all the great houses, inviting them to join or remain neutral, but with a warning that the Targaryen host was coming. If Cersei wanted a war, she would have it. For Arya, the days that followed blurred. She marched alongside the northern soldiers, sometimes riding a horse Gendry helped prepare for her. She often hung back, preferring to observe from the edges, wary of the throng. She heard men praising her name, calling her the hero of the long night, but she neither encouraged it nor condemned it. She was, in her own mind, simply Arya Stark, a girl with a list, a face once dedicated to the many-faced god. The oppressive weight of her role in shaping Westeros's future pressed on her shoulders. Jon tried to talk with her sometimes, to include her in councils of war, but she always demurred. She had never wanted to be a commander or a ruler. She was a killer. She had done her job. When they reached the twins, they found the castle under the uncertain leadership of a minor Frey cousin who had survived the massacre orchestrated by Arya herself. The phrase, "the Red Wedding avenged," was whispered among the local smallfolk. Many had fled or scattered, not sure who held the reins of power. Now, with the Targaryen host passing by, they surrendered quickly, offering to let the army cross the bridge unimpeded. Arya watched with a cold sense of satisfaction. She recalled how she had carved up Walder Frey, how she had served him a pie made from the flesh of his sons. The memory felt like another lifetime. Then she had been driven purely by revenge. Now she wondered if that same impulse might drive her to kill Cersei. She turned away from the twins once they crossed, refusing an offer to rest in the hall. The specter of old violence haunted those walls. Further south, they found the Riverlands in disarray. Most of the local lords had already marched north or stayed neutral, uncertain what to do. The Tullus, led by Edmure, welcomed them at Riverrun with cautious optimism. Edmure had heard rumor of the Night King's defeat and saw the Targaryen army's size, concluding that Cersei's hold on the throne was in jeopardy. He pledged his men to Jon and Daenerys. A war council convened in the Grand Hall of Riverrun, where banners of the leaping trout hung overhead. Arya stayed to the edges as usual. She listened to Tyrion discuss the state of King's Landing, how Qyburn might have new contraptions to counter dragons, how the Golden Company might bolster the Lannister forces. Daenerys's expression stayed resolute, occasionally flickering with anger at Cersei's betrayal. Jon was more measured, pressing for a method to spare as many innocent lives as possible. Grey Worm and the Unsullied stood quietly, their discipline unwavering. They decided to break the host into 3 divisions. One led by Jon, one by Daenerys riding with the dragons, and one under the direction of the Northern Lords. Tyrion would attempt negotiations, offering Cersei one final chance to surrender. No one believed she would accept. Arya found Gendry in the castle courtyard that evening, forging arrowheads for the northern archers. Sparks flew as his hammer pounded hot steel. She watched him for a while before speaking. "You can't help yourself, can you? You've just got to make more weapons." He set the hammer aside and wiped his brow. "I like to keep busy." He gave her a lopsided grin. "Better than standing around waiting." She approached, her posture relaxed. "That used to be me. Now I don't know what I am without waiting to pounce on something." His gaze flickered. "You've killed the worst thing in the world, Arya. That has to count for something. Maybe you don't need to kill anymore." She let out a small laugh, though there was no mirth in it. "Maybe. But Cersei's still alive." A shadow crossed Gendry's face. He remembered the list. The vow that Cersei was on it. "Do you plan to?" Arya shrugged. "I don't know. This is war. If it comes down to it, maybe she'll die in the fighting anyway." He studied her. "It's not just about your list, is it?" She looked away, uncertain how to explain the swirling conflict inside her. So many years she had defined herself by who she was going to kill, by the vengeance that carved her path. Now she had found a purpose beyond that, a purpose that saved the realm. But old habits and old scars did not fade easily. "I don't know what I'll do," she admitted softly. "But I don't plan to run from it." "Just be careful," Gendry murmured. "We almost lost you once." She gave him a faint nod, then turned away. The clang of steel followed her down the corridor. From Riverrun, the army advanced further down the King's Road. Scouts reported that Cersei had indeed hired the Golden Company and stationed them outside the city walls, along with the Lannister loyalists. The city's gates were closed and no one was allowed in or out. Tension rose among Daenerys's forces. They remembered the madness of the Mad King, the possibility that Cersei might use wildfire or other monstrous tactics to burn them all if it meant retaining the throne. Tyrion and Varys planned a final parley, hoping to spare the city from devastation. When they came within a day's march of King's Landing, Daenerys called a halt and established a wide camp. Tents sprouted in the fields, the dragons circled overhead. Arya gazed across the familiar shape of the city's walls, the red keep looming on its cliffs, the harbor dotted with ships. She had been here as a child, sneaking through backstreets with the Hound, witnessing her father's death in the plaza. All the memories churned in her chest. Now she stood outside those same gates as a champion of a new cause. Time was a strange circle. Tyrion rode forth under a white flag for the parley, accompanied by Davos, a handful of guards, and the Hound. Arya contemplated going with them, but at the last moment decided not to. She waited at the edge of camp, scanning the walls for any sign of trickery. The hiss of wind from Drogon's wings overhead was a constant reminder of the Targaryen might. Rhaegal perched on a nearby hill, watchful. As expected, the parley was fruitless. Cersei did not appear herself, she sent Qyburn. Tyrion argued, cajoled, threatened, but to no avail. Qyburn left them with a simple statement: "Her Grace will not surrender. Return to your queen and advise her that to attack the city is to burn innocent lives. She will do what she must to protect her throne." Tyrion tried once more to appeal to reason, but Qyburn turned away. The gates were barred behind him. Tyrion came back to camp with grim resignation. The next morning, Daenerys prepared for battle. Jon tried again to reason with her about a siege, about avoiding a direct confrontation that would see King's Landing go up in flames. She listened, but her desire to avoid the mistakes of her father warred with her desire to end Cersei's reign swiftly. The memory of Missandei's death, if this timeline still had that same tragedy, tugged at her. In this version of events, perhaps Missandei was still alive if captured, though in many tellings, Missandei had been executed as a show of force by Cersei. That might be the impetus for Daenerys's rage. The details shifted from the known show timeline, but the essence remained. Daenerys saw only one path: Cersei's utter defeat. So the armies formed ranks. The Golden Company lined the walls, row upon row of shining armor and spears. Lannister archers peered down from the battlements. The Scorpion ballistae, designed to kill dragons, jutted from towers. Arya stood with the northern contingent, her eyes scanning the parapets. The Hound was close by, glaring at the city as though it were a personal affront. Sansa had remained at Winterfell, leaving her sworn knights under the command of loyal bannermen, but occasionally Arya wished she were here to see the final vengeance on House Lannister. She wanted it for her family, for her father especially. A war horn bellowed. Daenerys soared overhead astride Drogon, while Rhaegal circled, piloted by none other than Jon Snow, who had, after some coaxing, learned to ride the dragon. The sight of two dragons in the sky made the defenders tremble. Arya felt a thrill of savage excitement. This was no trifling matter. The Mad King's daughter had come to claim what she believed was hers. The ground troops marched forward, siege towers rolled into place. A final chance was given for surrender. Silence from the walls. Then Daenerys unleashed the dragon's fire upon the scorpions. Drogon's roar shook the air, and flames raked across the battlements. Several ballista operators fled in terror or burned alive. The Golden Company realized they could not simply stand their ground under dragon fire, so they attempted a sortie, charging out of the gates on horseback to meet the Unsullied. Grey Worm's disciplined ranks formed a spear wall. Swords clashed, horns blared. The field erupted in violence. Arya advanced with the northern lines. She was more used to swift infiltration than open battle, but she kept pace with them, scanning for a path into the city. The gates were forced open by a combination of dragonfire and ramming from catapults. Soon, the defenders inside the gate were overrun by Dothraki screamers who poured in with their curved blades. Smoke rose from the outer districts as pockets of fighting spread through the streets. Some civilians, terrified, ran in all directions, fleeing deeper into the city. Arya grit her teeth, feeling a knot in her stomach. She hated the chaos of war. the screams of innocence trapped in the crossfire. If Cersei had any care for her people, she might have yielded. But that was not who Cersei Lannister was. The fighting churned forward, unstoppable, until the Targaryen forces seized the main gatehouse. Bells began to ring in the city, not necessarily the sign of surrender but a panicked call to arms. Or perhaps it was a plea for mercy from the small folk. Tension crackled. Daenerys soared overhead, scanning the city that had once belonged to her forebears. Amid the chaos, Arya slipped away from the main host. While others fought in the streets, she ducked through alleyways. Smoke drifted along the rooftops. In the distance, she heard the dragons roar again. The ground shook as a portion of the city wall collapsed. She pressed on, ignoring the throngs of fleeing citizens, the wounded and dying. She had one goal in mind, the Red Keep. She had come here to end the last name that had burned into her mind since the day she saw her father die. If the chance arose, she would kill Cersei Lannister. This was not a heroic act. It was personal, primal. But part of her also believed it might spare countless lives if the war ended quickly. With Cersei gone, her remaining forces might surrender. She navigated the twisting streets with ease, calling upon her memory from years ago. She was older now, faster, and more lethal. Guards in Lannister armor barred her way at one point, but they were dealing with the panic of the city. She slipped by them in the confusion. In a side street, she encountered a cluster of the Golden Company. Swiftly, she ducked behind crates, her dagger at the ready. She waited for them to move on, and then she moved again, unstoppable as a wraith. The ring of steel and the stench of smoke pressed in from all sides. At last, she reached the courtyard outside the Red Keep gates. A contingent of Lannister soldiers stood there, determined to defend the approach. The gates behind them were sealed. Overhead, the ramparts bristled with archers. Arya crouched behind a fallen statue, breathing hard. Rushing in alone would be suicide. She closed her eyes, recalling the faces, the stealth, the illusions she had mastered in Bravos. She had not used those skills in some time, but they remained within her. She took a breath, trying to muster that sense of emptiness, of being no one. Then she recalled she did indeed have a face in her pouch, a leftover from her time in the House of Black and White. Some nameless Lannister guard she had dealt with outside Winterfell once. She quickly donned it, feeling the prickling of magic as her face shifted. Her stature was still small, but the face might pass a cursory glance, particularly in the chaos. She slung a stolen cloak over her shoulders and walked forward. The Lannister guards paid her little mind, thinking her just another soldier. She marched right up to the gate, heart pounding. Once there, she saw it was barricaded from within. Perfect. She moved to stand near a group of men trying to lift debris and bar the gate further. Quickly, with a sudden strike, she stabbed one in the kidney. He collapsed with a strangled cry. The others turned, but she was already slipping behind them, slicing throats. In the confusion, they fell, blood splattering across the stones. The rest of the guards outside the gate yelled in alarm, but by then Arya had kicked aside the brace on the gate. She threw all her weight into pushing it open. Shouts erupted. Some of the Lannister guards rushed to close it again, but a surge of Dothraki who had spotted the gap roared from behind. The gate was forced open, letting a wave of Targaryen-allied fighters flood into the courtyard. A melee erupted. Arya used that moment to slip deeper into the Red Keep, discarding the face in a hidden alcove. She was Arya Stark again, barefaced, knife in hand. The corridors echoed with panicked footsteps. Nobles and servants ran frantically. She forced her way past them, ignoring their pleas. She ascended the winding staircases that led toward the royal chambers. She heard the roars of dragons overhead, the thunder of battle outside. She passed a cluster of Lannister soldiers racing in the opposite direction, too focused on meeting the invaders to notice her. At last, she reached the door to the Queen's private chambers. 2 members of the Kingsguard stood before it. They brandished swords, challenge in their eyes. Arya braced herself. She darted forward with incredible speed. One guard swung his sword horizontally, but she ducked under the arc and jammed her dagger upward into his armpit. As he fell, the second guard brought his blade down in a savage blow. Arya twisted, her shoulder burning as the steel grazed her. She hissed, but recovered quickly, pivoting behind him and burying her dagger in his back. Both collapsed in seconds. She kicked open the doors, panting. Inside the chamber, the figure of Queen Cersei Lannister waited in a swirl of red velvet and gold. She clutched a small dagger of her own, her eyes wild. The final days of her reign had not been kind. Her hair was longer than when Arya last saw her from afar, but her face was lined with fury and desperation. Arya stepped forward, blood dripping from her dagger. "So the wolf comes at last," Cersei spat. Her voice trembled, but her pride remained. "You think you've won because your sister killed those monsters in the north? That you can claim what's mine?" "I don't want the throne," Arya said softly. "I'm here for you." The chill in her tone was more terrifying than a roar. Cersei's hand tightened around her dagger. She was not a warrior, but she would not kneel either. "If you kill me, you become just like me. A murderer," she sneered, though there was a tremor of fear beneath her bravado. Arya didn't respond. The memory of her father's death flickered behind her eyes. She remembered the day she stood in the crowd watching the sword fall. She remembered the Red Wedding, the countless betrayals. She thought of the vile things Cersei had done to Sansa, to Tyrion, to anyone who stood in her path. She could end it here, once and for all, end the root of so many evils in this realm. She stepped closer. Cersei slashed wildly with her dagger, but Arya knocked it aside easily. She pressed the blade of Valyrian steel to Cersei's throat. The queen gasped, her eyes wide. Somewhere outside, the city burned and the bells rang in a confused cacophony, a macabre chorus for this final confrontation. "You want me to beg?" Cersei hissed, tears of anger in her eyes. "I will never beg." Arya's voice was low. "I don't care what you do." For a moment, time froze. She saw the pure hate in Cersei's eyes, the flicker of madness. This woman would never stop trying to hurt her family or claw her way back to power. Arya knew that if she let her live, more suffering would follow. This was justice. This was vengeance. And so she drew a breath and sliced her dagger across Cersei's throat. The queen's eyes went wide, her mouth opened in a wet gasp, and she collapsed to her knees, blood pouring down the front of her gown. Arya stepped back, the blade dripping. Cersei reached out a trembling hand as though to grasp Arya's face, but her strength failed. She pitched forward, eyes glazing with shock and horror, and then she stilled forever. Arya stared at the body for a long moment, her heart pounding. The name of Cersei Lannister had been on her list from the beginning. Now the list was shorter by one more name. She felt an odd emptiness swirl in her gut, not the triumphant joy she expected. Even as she recognized that this might save countless lives, vengeance was a hollow sensation. She turned away, stepping over the bodies of the fallen King's Guard. Outside, she heard the sounds of fighting beginning to die down, the ring of steel growing more sporadic. Perhaps the Lannisters were surrendering, or Daenerys' forces had overwhelmed them. She walked through the corridors in a numb haze, stepping past frightened servants, disoriented soldiers. Some recognized the blood-soaked girl as an enemy, but none dared challenge her, not with that icy look in her eyes and the dagger in her hand. At last, she emerged into the courtyard, where the Golden Lion banners were in the process of being torn down. The Targaryen sigil was hoisted by a cluster of Unsullied. The wind carried the stench of ash and charred stone, but the worst of the destruction seemed contained. Tyrion was there, face ashen, surveying the aftermath. Grey Worm was methodically ordering the city's defenders to lay down arms. Daenerys and Jon landed their dragons in the wide plaza near the Red Keep's gates. Cheers rose from the Targaryen soldiers. Civilians cowered. The bell continued to toll, uncertain if the city had truly surrendered or not. Arya walked up to Jon, who dismounted from Regal with a grim expression. Daenerys slipped off Drogon's back and faced Arya warily. They all wore the exhaustion of battle. Jon opened his mouth to speak, but caught sight of the blood on Arya's cloak and the stony set of her features. "Cersei?" he asked, voice hushed. Arya nodded. "She's dead." Daenerys exhaled. "So it's over," she murmured. "Then the city is ours." Jon looked at Arya, a mixture of relief and sorrow on his face. You did what you had to." Arya said nothing, only nodded once. She wanted to feel something more than this numb acceptance. But war was war. She had spent years preparing for these moments. Perhaps part of her expected closure, but found only emptiness. A meager comfort might come from knowing her family was avenged, that the realm was free of Cersei's tyranny, that she had saved the world from the undead. But she was still Arya Stark, a young woman shaped by death. She felt the wind stir her hair, carrying smoke and the faint cries of the wounded. Daenerys turned to address the soldiers beginning to gather, and her voice rang out in triumph. The tyrant is gone. The Iron Throne is ours to claim. The city is ours to save if we so choose. We will spare the innocent who lay down their arms. She shot a fierce look at Grey Worm, who nodded. She did not want to rule over ashes. This victory had come at a cost, but not nearly as catastrophic as it might have been if the Night King had attacked them first. In that sense, Arya's earlier deed had saved countless lives beyond just the realm's survival. They had been spared the desperation that led Daenerys to burn King's Landing in another version of events. This time, she felt enough hope to show mercy. In the days that followed, the city was slowly brought under control. Daenerys Targaryen was hailed as the new queen, with Jon at her side, though the tension between them remained over the question of the throne. Some whispered that Jon was the true heir, but he refused to press a claim that would lead to more conflict. Tyrion and Davos worked tirelessly to restore order, to feed the small folk, and to rebuild. The Golden Company had been shattered, the Lannisters' leadership decapitated with Cersei gone. Some loyalists tried to mount resistance, but they were quickly subdued. A measure of stability emerged. Arya spent her time helping track down pockets of leftover soldiers who refused to surrender, ensuring that no more bloodshed than necessary took place. She felt uneasy in the city. Memories lurked around every corner. The place where her father had been executed, the spots where she once scavenged for food after fleeing the Red Keep. It all felt like a haunted labyrinth she had outgrown. Some recognized her as the Night Slayer, the hero from the north who had ended the White Walkers. Now, some also whispered that she was the one who slew Queen Cersei. A hush of fear or awe followed her. She was not sure which was worse, anonymity or this newfound fame. One day, as she stood by the ruins of the Great September, or what was left of it after the explosions of wildfire from earlier events, she was joined by Tyrion. He approached slowly, hands clasped. "I wanted to thank you," he said, voice subdued, "for ending this quickly, for preventing more bloodshed." Arya turned her head. "That's not why I did it, but I'm glad fewer people died." Tyrion smiled faintly. "Intentions aside, your actions have given the realm a chance for peace." She looked away at the scorched rubble. "I'm leaving soon." He tilted his head. "Where to?" "Back to Winterfell, maybe, or maybe somewhere else. I have things to see." She paused, uncertain. "I never wanted to stay in one place, not after everything." He nodded, seeming to understand. "A wolf that roams free. Well, if you ever find yourself in King's Landing again, I suspect you'll always have a place at court. Daenerys, for all her talk of queenship, knows she owes you a debt. I doubt anyone in the realm would refuse you hospitality." Arya let out a small snort. "I'm not used to receiving hospitality. I'm not sure I'd know what to do with it." Tyrion's eyes sparkled with a hint of humor. "Take it, perhaps. After all you've done, I'd say you deserve a bit of comfort." She offered a half-smile. "We'll see." He dipped his head in a gesture of respect, then left her to her thoughts. Arya stared at the broken stones. She remembered her father's voice again, telling her about the north, about the heart trees. She remembered the quiet mantras of the faceless men. She felt pulled in many directions. She was a Stark, yet she had traveled the world, learned to kill, learned to hide in plain sight. Perhaps there was more out there. Perhaps she might find a new purpose beyond the next name on her list. She realized her list was almost empty. It struck her that for years, the list had been her anchor. Now it was done. She took a breath and walked away from the September. She found Jon near the Red Keep's courtyard, instructing a group of northern soldiers. When he saw her, he dismissed them and approached. "I've heard you're leaving," he said. Arya nodded. "Yes, the city. I've never liked it. I've done what I needed to do. We both have." Jon's face was a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I'm going back north soon as well. Daenerys wants to secure the throne, but I have no desire to remain here. The north is my home." "I heard talk that you might become king consort," Arya said lightly, teasing. Jon made a face. "I'm not much for titles or for southern palaces. Queens, kings, they can fight over the throne if they wish. I just want to keep our people safe." Arya placed a hand on his arm. "You'll always have my support, Jon." He smiled, the same warm smile that reminded her of their childhood. "Stay safe out there. I hope you find what you're looking for." She shrugged. "I'm not sure what that is yet. Sometimes that's the best reason to go," Jon said softly. They embraced briefly. Then she turned and walked off. A faint pang clutched at her heart. But she knew she wasn't the sort to stay in one place. Sansa could rule Winterfell if it came to that. Jon could watch over the north. Bran had his mysterious wisdom. Arya was a wanderer, an adventurer now, shaped by death but still capable of living. She had seen the darkest of nights and ended it before it truly began. She had faced the face of the Night King and won. She had avenged her family on the one who tormented them from the throne. Now, perhaps she could find something like freedom in the wide world. As she left King's Landing on horseback, weaving through the battered gates, a hush followed her. Some recognized her, bowed slightly, or simply turned their eyes away. She was a legend already, but she was also just a girl from the north with a sword and a dagger, riding into the unknown. The city's spires receded behind her in the haze. Ahead, the King's Road stretched on, flanked by fields and distant hills. The wind tugged at her cloak. She remembered a conversation with Lady Crane in Bravos, speaking about beginnings and endings. Arya had chosen life then, chosen to reclaim her name. Now she had shaped the destiny of the realm. She allowed herself one small grin at the thought of the many illusions, the transformations she had undergone to reach this point. Child, wolf, faceless assassin, savior, monster, hero. She was all of those and she was none of those. She was simply Arya Stark, a girl with quick feet and a ready blade, who had changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Beyond that, the future was hers to discover. She kicked her horse into a trot. The road opened before her, wide and full of unseen possibilities. Overhead, a cold wind blew down from the north, but she did not fear the cold. She was the wolf of Winterfell, the Night Slayer, the girl who said, "Not today," to death. She had survived. She had won. And with that triumph behind her, she rode onward, carrying the hopes of her family and the memories of the dead, free at last from the specter of the long night. Arya Stark rode out of King's Landing under a sky of cold winter sunlight, her cloak trailing behind her like a streak of dark fur. She pressed her knees into the flanks of her mare and urged the horse to a steady canter along the King's Road. Behind her lay the city she had come to loathe from a young age, the city where her father lost his head, where she had once scurried like a gutter rat, nameless and half-starved. Now King's Landing bowed to new rulers. Daenerys Targaryen had laid her claim. Cersei was dead by Arya's own hand, and everything felt strangely quiet in the aftermath. No undead threatened from the north. No storm of ice devoured the living. The chaos of war had died to embers that smoldered in the city's ruined districts. She left that conflagration behind, her mind churning with thoughts of the past and the uncertain future. She traveled alone, but she was no longer the frightened child who once fled the Red Keep. People recognized her now. Word had spread, carried by rumor and awe. The Night Slayer, the hero who ended the Great Other, the quiet wolf who had slain the queen. Sometimes she felt those titles like invisible weights around her shoulders, heavier than the mail she wore beneath her tunic. She had never asked for fame, never longed for the cheers or the fear that followed her. Yet as she rode northward, villagers paused in their daily tasks when she passed. Some turned away, frightened she might be a specter come to judge them. Others bowed respectfully or stammered thanks, though for what precisely, they were unsure. A few approached with pleas about bandits, about lost loved ones, about the uncertain times. She listened, but rarely lingered. She was no lord, no lady, merely Arya Stark, continuing her path. On the third day out of King's Landing, she stopped at a modest roadside near a hamlet called Sow's Crossing. The building was thatch-roofed, the sign squeaking on its rusted hinges. Inside, the smell of turnip stew and sour ale filled the common room. Arya found a corner table and quietly ordered a bowl and some fresh bread. She pulled her hood low, determined not to draw attention, but the innkeep's wife brought the food with wide eyes. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman whispered. They say you killed the Night King." Arya sighed inwardly. "People say a lot of things. I'm just hungry." The woman smiled nervously. "Of course, my lady. My apologies." She lingered, as though expecting Arya to say more, but Arya did not indulge her. At last, the innkeep's wife bobbed a curtsy and hurried off to the kitchen. Arya tore off a piece of bread and dunked it in the stew, ignoring the occasional glance from the other patrons. She considered asking about local news, but decided against it. She was tired of hearing the same hum of rumors. That Daenerys Targaryen was crowned in the Red Keep, that the city was battered but had not burned entirely, that the undead were truly gone. People repeated the rumor of the Night King's destruction in hushed, disbelieving tones. Some insisted it must have been a dragon. Others said it was Jon Snow, the king in the north. Her name flitted in and out of these accounts like a half-forgotten secret. Arya wanted no part in clarifying them. Night fell soon after she finished her meal, and she rented a small room that smelled of must and old straw. It reminded her of the many nights she had spent hiding in barns and cellars during the War of the Five Kings. The memory made her uneasy. She lay awake for a time, dagger under her pillow, listening to the soft hush of voices below and the rustle of trees in the wind outside. Sleep took her only in fitful snatches. She dreamed of a swirling storm of dust, the remains of the undead host after she slew their master. Then the dream shifted to the Red Keep, and she saw Cersei kneeling on blood-stained tiles, eyes wide in shock. She felt again the strange hollowness of that moment. She had thought she would feel triumph or relief, but all she'd found was emptiness. When morning came, she rose before dawn and saddled her mare. Without bidding anyone farewell, she rode on. Days passed with a certain monotony. The King's Road stretched long before her, winding through farmland scarred by the brief Targaryen advance that had marched south. Still, she saw fewer signs of devastation than she would have if the war with the dead had happened in earnest. The farmland had not been trampled by white hordes, and the living had not been forced to burn their fields. Winter still hovered in the air, but the final blow of that terrible season had never arrived. Spring might not be far off if the gods were kind. She rode on through drizzling rain, the hood of her cloak drawn up, ignoring the chill that settled in her bones. On the seventh day, she passed the ruins of an old fortress likely destroyed years ago in some minor skirmish and took shelter in its crumbling walls for the night. She camped beneath a half-fallen arch, building a small fire with gathered driftwood and fallen branches. The flame crackled softly in the dark. She ate the last of her bread and cheese, sipping from a water skin. Quiet enveloped her. She remembered Gendry telling her not so long ago that she deserved some comfort in life. But comfort felt alien. Even now, with the realm saved, she was always on edge, always expecting betrayal or danger. She looked at her blade, the Valyrian steel dagger that had changed the world, and wondered if it would ever truly be put to rest. Her plan, if she had one, was to head to Winterfell eventually. But a part of her wanted to wander, to slip into the trackless unknown. Another part wanted to see if there was truly a way to sail west of Westeros and discover uncharted lands. That dream was a whisper in her mind, a promise of something new. Yet she owed it to her siblings to at least see them again, to make sure they were safe. She owed them that much. When she woke at dawn the next day, a fine mist cloaked the landscape, and she almost missed the figure approaching the ruin from the road. Her instincts flared. She quickly packed her bedroll, strapped her dagger to her hip, and readied herself. The approaching figure was a man on foot, draped in a weather-worn cloak. He stopped at the broken arch, spotting Arya's mare tethered to a chunk of stone, then peered into the gloom where Arya stood. His stance was cautious but not overtly threatening. He was tall, with a trimmed black beard flecked with gray and a soldier's bearing. "Morning," he said, voice echoing slightly in the silent ruin. "Didn't realize anyone else had the same idea for shelter." He raised both hands, showing they were empty. I mean no harm. I'm just a traveler like you. Arya studied him for a moment. You can keep your distance, she replied flatly. I'm leaving soon anyway. He nodded and stepped back a pace. Fair enough. Name's Comwyn. Former soldier in the Stormlands. Now I'm just looking for work or a place to settle. His eyes shifted, taking in her gear. She had a sturdy mount, well-made leathers, and a dagger that gleamed with an edge too fine for common steel. He looked uneasy. You came down from King's Landing? I did, Arya allowed. His mouth twitched. Then you'll know more than I do about the new queen. She said nothing. She swung up into her saddle, adjusting the cloak around her shoulders. Comwyn stepped aside. He glanced at her with a hint of curiosity. I heard about the Night King being slain, how an army of the living marched south and took King's Landing from Cersei Lannister. Hard to believe it all happened in such a short time. Arya made a noncommittal noise. Believe whatever you like. She nudged her mare forward. Safe travels. Comwyn dipped his head, stepping out of her path, and that was the end of their meeting. She rode out of the ruin, picking up the King's Road once more. The drizzle had eased, but clouds still loomed overhead. She wondered how many such men were wandering the realm now, displaced soldiers, sellswords, or small folk. A war that ended too quickly still left behind the rubble of old loyalties, heartbreak, and confusion. She supposed it was better than the alternative of winter snows burying the entire land beneath an army of the dead. The miles slipped by, and soon she recognized the lush fields and gentle slopes of the Riverlands. The memory of traveling through these lands after her father's death hovered at the edges of her mind. She recalled the men she had seen tortured by Lannister soldiers, the endless columns of refugees, the wolves that prowled after battles. The Riverlands had bled many times from many wars. Now it seemed oddly peaceful, livestock grazed, farmers tended to their tasks. She caught glimpses of new watchtowers or minor repairs to older keeps. Word must have come from Riverrun that the war was over, that the Targaryen queen had ascended, and that there would be no more ravages of the undead. The small folk took this as a sign to rebuild. Late one afternoon, she came upon a wide ford where a handful of travelers waited to cross. The ferry was operated by a barrel-chested man with a heavy pole, who eyed each passenger suspiciously until they dropped a coin in his palm. Arya dismounted and led her mare aboard. The ferry swayed, water lapping at its sides. A pair of local merchants chatted about the state of the roads. A young mother held the hand of a toddler who wouldn't stop squirming. When the ferry shoved off from the bank, the older merchant asked casually if Arya was heading to Riverrun. She shook her head and said nothing else. Eventually, they left her alone. Upon reaching the other side, she led her mare up the muddy bank. Though the sun was getting low, she felt only a mild desire to stop. Her days of endless travel had hardened her. She could push on for hours more if needed. She paused only when she reached a small clearing near a stream, where she gave the horse a moment to drink. While the mare lapped at the water, Arya crouched, splashing cold handfuls on her face. The water was bracing. She shut her eyes, letting the chill wash away the road's dust and her lingering regrets. She reflected that once, in Bravos, she had learned to submerge her feelings in order to become no one. But she had chosen to be someone. She was Arya Stark, and that meant confronting all the joys and sorrows that came with a name. When she opened her eyes again, she saw her reflection in the water's surface. A face sharper than the child who once left Winterfell, with faint scars earned over the years and a gaze that no longer belonged to an innocent. Perhaps that was the price of everything she had done. She took a breath and rose to her feet. She was nearing Harrenhal, or so the signpost indicated. That cursed ruin loomed on the horizon, black towers like the twisted fingers of a dying god. She remembered her time there. Tywin Lannister's presence, the horrors of the tickler. Gooseflesh prickled her arms. Even if it lay directly on her path, she did not want to linger. By nightfall, she could see the monstrous silhouette clearly, a broken fortress against the moonlit sky. She steered her mare wide, taking a smaller road that skirted the fortress's perimeter. Even from a distance, she could feel the weight of Harrenhal's grim history bearing down on her. She found no inn that night. Instead, she made camp in the shelter of a cluster of alder trees. She ate a bit of salt beef and stale bread, washing it down with water. The wind rustled the branches overhead, and the ruined towers stood ominous beyond her sight. She tried not to think of them. Instead, she let her mind drift to the north, to Winterfell. She imagined Sansa, seated in the great hall, pen in hand as she managed the castle's affairs. She pictured Bran in his wheeled chair near the Godswood. Jon might be returning there soon, if he had finished helping Daenerys secure King's Landing. She thought of Gendry as well. He would likely remain in King's Landing, forging new arms and armor, or perhaps traveling at the Queen's behest. A wave of complicated feelings swept over her. She missed him, yet part of her knew she would never be content forging a quiet life at someone's side. The restlessness in her soul was too strong. That night, her dreams were mercifully empty. The next day, she rose with the dawn and continued north. The roads grew more familiar, marked by old signposts bearing the Merman of House Manderly or the Wolf's Head of House Stark, chipped and faded by years of neglect. She took note of how the farmland gave way to rolling hills. Fewer travelers passed her now. Most people in these parts had retreated to their strongholds for the winter that never fully came. She saw traces of new fortifications along the highways, a sign that the North had prepared for war with the dead. Now, with the threat gone, some defenses had been abandoned half-finished. In a few places, men still worked on them, perhaps from a sense of caution or a desire to be ready for the next danger. Arya couldn't decide if it was wise or simply a sad sign that peace never lasted for long in Westeros. In the late afternoon of a crisp, clear day, she finally crested a ridge and caught sight of Winterfell's towers rising from the plain. Smoke curled from its chimneys and banners bearing the dire wolf sigil fluttered along its battlements. A swell of emotion choked her throat. For all the darkness and brutality she had witnessed, Winterfell was still home in a way no other place could be. She urged her mare forward, her pulse quickening. She had not told anyone she was coming. She wondered if the guards would even recognize her. She had changed so much. She approached the gates just as the last glow of sunset bled across the sky, turning the fields to gold and scarlet. The watchman atop the gate peered down at her. She tugged back her hood, letting him see her face. Confusion flickered across the guard's features, then realization dawned. "Open the gates," he called down. "Lady Arya returns." The portcullis rumbled upward and she passed into the courtyard. The scent of wood smoke and old stone filled her senses, mingled with memories of a childhood lost to time. An older stable hand hurried forward to take her reins. She recognized him faintly as a man named Larys, who had been a boy when she left. His eyes rounded in awe, but he said nothing, simply bowing as she dismounted. She left the horse in his care and walked across the courtyard, her boots thumping on the flagstones. Servants paused to stare, some curtsying or bowing. She felt a flicker of discomfort at the attention, but she kept moving. At the main doors leading into the keep, she was met by Brienne of Tarth. The tall knight wore a simple surcoat over her mail, the direwolf sigil embroidered on the breast. Surprise lit Brienne's eyes as she took in Arya's appearance. Her hair had grown a bit, though it remained shorter than many ladies, and the set of her shoulders hinted at new burdens carried since they last met. "Arya," Brienne said, voice caught between relief and respect. "We didn't know you were coming. When did you arrive in the north?" "Just now," Arya replied. She forced a small smile. "Is Sansa here?" "She is. Lady Sansa will be glad to see you." Brienne's composure slipped briefly, showing genuine warmth. "Welcome home." She shook her head. "We've all heard how you killed the Night King before the battle." "Thank you." Arya's mouth quirked. It had to be done. She didn't want to dwell on it. "Where's my sister?" "In her solar, I believe. She's been meeting with some of the bannermen about the harvest." "I'll take you to her." Brienne led her through the familiar corridors lit by torches against the gathering gloom. The air inside Winterfell felt slightly warmer than outside, a testament to the ancient hot springs beneath the castle that heated the stones. Memories tugged at Arya with every step, wrestling with Bran in the hallway, sneaking away from Septa Mordane's lessons, daydreaming about sword fights. Yet she was no child now. Her footfalls were measured, quiet, like a predator that knows its den but remains cautious. They reached a large door guarded by two men in Stark livery. Brienne spoke softly to them, and one opened the door. Inside was a cozy solar with a table covered in parchments and a small hearth crackling. Sansa sat at the table, speaking in low tones with Maester Wolkan. She wore a dark gown trimmed with gray fur, her hair coiled in a braided crown that reflected her authority as Lady of Winterfell. At the sound of the door, she looked up and her eyes went wide at the sight of Arya. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping. "Arya?" Her voice was hushed as though she feared speaking the name might be some dream conjured by the firelight. Arya stepped forward, tension in her chest easing at the sight of her sister's face. "Hello, Sansa." In a heartbeat, Sansa crossed the room and pulled Arya into an embrace. She smelled of lavender and parchment, and her arms were warm despite the crisp air. Arya stiffened slightly. She had never been one for embraces, but then she relaxed, returning the hug briefly. There was a quiet moment where neither spoke, where the hush of the hearth crackled around them. Sansa drew back, eyes bright with tears. She reached to cup Arya's face as if to convince herself this was real. "You're all right," she said, voice quavering. "We heard you left King's Landing. We didn't know if you would come here or— Oh, Arya, it's so good to see you." Arya swallowed. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed her sister until now. "I'm fine," she said softly. "How are you? How's Winterfell?" Sansa took a breath and turned, dismissing Maester Wolkan with a small nod. The Maester slipped out, followed by Brienne. The door closed, leaving the sisters in private. Sansa gestured to a seat near the hearth. "Winterfell stands," she began. "We lost fewer men than we'd feared because you acted. The Night King never came, the great battle never happened. The lords have been rebuilding their defenses anyway, uncertain if some new horror might arise. But for now, we focus on the harvest and preparing for a normal winter. If the winter indeed comes." Arya settled in the seat. The warmth of the fire felt almost too much after weeks on the road. "And you?" Sansa lowered herself onto a nearby bench, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been managing the North in Jon's absence. He wrote to me a few weeks ago saying the war in the south was quick. Cersei refused to surrender, but Daenerys and her dragons overwhelmed her forces. He said you were responsible for Cersei's end as well." She paused, letting the words hang. "Is that true?" Arya pressed her lips together and nodded. She glanced at the flames. "She was on my list. I won't pretend it was purely noble, but I also knew there would be less bloodshed if the queen was removed. Daenerys might have burnt the city otherwise, or more of it." Sansa's gaze was soft, but unwavering. "So it's over. All those who tore our family apart, gone." "Yes," Arya said quietly. She could see the swirl of emotion in Sansa's eyes. They had both wanted justice for so long. Now that it was achieved, all that remained was the aftermath. "Where is Bran?" "In the Godswood," Sansa replied. "He spends most of his time there. He's changed again since we last saw him. Sometimes I think each passing day makes him less Bran and more something else." A flicker of sadness crossed her face. "But he still looks out for us in his own way." Arya nodded. "I'll see him soon." Then she hesitated. "Jon? Is he coming back?" Sansa exhaled, a subtle tension showing at the mention of their brother-cousin. "He said he would return as soon as Daenerys has matters in King's Landing under control. He has no taste for the southern court. And—" she paused as though weighing a confidence. "He is torn about the question of his lineage. Daenerys knows he has a claim to the throne," he told her. "It's caused strife, but from what he's written, they've reached some kind of understanding. He won't challenge her claim, and she won't press him to remain in the capital. At least for now." Arya gave a sharp nod. "He was never one for politics. He's a northerner through and through." A thin smile tugged at Sansa's lips. "Yes." She studied Arya's face. "And you? What do you plan to do now that you're here? Will you stay?" Arya had asked herself the same question countless times on the road, and she still had no clear answer. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I wanted to see you, make sure you were all right. But she trailed off, searching for words. "There's a whole world beyond these walls. Maybe I need to see more of it." Sansa nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I feared you might say that. You've always been the one to wander." She took a breath. "But you have a home here as long as you want it." They lapsed into silence. The crackling fire filled the stillness, and Arya found herself glancing around the solar, noticing changes since she'd last been here. New tapestries, new furniture. The castle still bore the spirit of their childhood, but it was an older, more somber place now. After a moment, Sansa sighed and stood. "You should rest. I'll have them prepare a room for you. A hot meal, a bath, whatever you need. We'll have time to talk more later." Arya rose as well. Despite her restlessness, her body ached from the journey. A bath sounded heavenly. "Thank you," she said simply. Sansa offered a faint, fond smile. "Welcome home, Arya." They left the solar together, stepping into the corridors. A servant appeared, bowing and gesturing for Arya to follow him. As Arya walked away from Sansa, she glanced back once. Her sister stood by the door, hands clasped, watching Arya's back. There was warmth in Sansa's expression, and perhaps a shadow of worry as well. Soon, Arya found herself in a small but comfortable chamber in one of the towers, with a brazier that chased away the chill. A basin of steaming water awaited her, along with cloths and scented soap. She dismissed the servant's offer of help. She could wash herself well enough. Stripping off her dusty clothes and leathers, she let out a soft breath of relief as she sank her hands into the warm water, sponging away the grime of travel. She scrubbed her hair, careful of the tangles, and dried off with a linen cloth. For a moment, she simply stood naked in the dim light, feeling both vulnerable and oddly at peace. She had spent so many nights sleeping rough with one eye open. The stone walls of Winterfell provided a security she didn't know she still craved. She slipped on a simple gray tunic and breeches, ignoring the dresses Sansa had probably arranged for her. She was no lady in that sense, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Then she set her dagger near the bedside, an old habit she could not break. She sat on the bed, running a hand over the soft blankets. Her mind whirled with questions of what to do now, how to live in a realm that no longer needed her blade at every turn. But the day's travel had drained her, and before she could find an answer, weariness overcame her. She lay down, letting her eyes close. The gentle lull of the castle's hush carried her into a deep sleep. She woke near dawn the next morning, feeling almost disoriented by the comfort of a real bed. Outside, the courtyard bustled with the changing of the night watch. She dressed quickly, buckled on her dagger, and wandered the corridors until she reached the godwood. The morning air was crisp, and a thin veil of mist clung to the red leaves of the weirwood. She found Bran near the heart tree, exactly where Sansa said he would be. He sat in his wheeled chair, gazing at the carved face in the tree's trunk. Snow dusted the ground in patches, but the hot springs that flowed beneath Winterfell kept the godwood from full frost. Bran turned his head when he heard her approach, his eyes distant. "Arya," he said calmly, as though he had been expecting her. His voice had that odd quality, half an echo of the boy he'd been, half something far older. Arya stepped forward. "Bran," she answered. She studied him. Even in the short time since she last saw him, his face seemed thinner, his eyes more knowing. He wore a heavy cloak lined with wolf fur, and his hands rested motionless on the arms of the chair. He regarded her quietly, the corner of his mouth curving in the slightest smile. "I'm glad you're here. You've been traveling for a while." She wasn't surprised he knew. He often spoke as though he could see beyond the constraints of time and distance. "I came to see the family." "And you?" Bran nodded. "It's good to have you home. You may not stay, but it's still good." She felt a pang. "You know me too well." She glanced at the roots of the heart tree, remembering how they dipped into the hot spring pools, how her father once prayed here. "Does that bother you?" He shook his head slowly. "No. We're all on our own paths." He paused, regarding her with that uncanny gaze. "The dead are gone. You killed their master. Now the realm moves forward, still shaped by human hearts, still shaped by old grudges and new hopes. You've played your part in ensuring there's a realm left to squabble over. That was your destiny, in many ways." Arya hesitated. She was never entirely sure how to respond to Bran's cryptic insights. "I just did what needed doing," she murmured. "And so you did," Bran agreed. "I see many possibilities, Arya, but none require you to remain in one place unless you choose it. Sansa is forging a strong north. Jon will return. They will lead, each in their own way. You carry the north with you wherever you go." She studied him, trying to read whatever flickered behind his eyes. "Then I suppose that's settled." A hint of sardonic amusement colored her tone. "Though I might stay a little while, at least. Catch my breath." He offered a small, knowing nod. "Take as long as you need. The world will wait." They stood or sat together in silence, the heart tree's pale bark streaked with red sap that looked like fresh wounds. Arya thought of the old gods. She wondered if they had guided her hand when she thrust the dagger into the Night King, or if it was merely her own skill and will. She might never know. Eventually, she turned away, leaving Bran to his communion with the godwood. As she made her way back to the main courtyard, she caught sight of a fresh flurry of activity. a small party of riders entering the gates. At their head was a man on a stout mountain horse, clad in thick furs and carrying the banner of House Mormont. Lyanna Mormont had been Lady of Bear Island, but she was gone, killed in the original war with the Whites, though in this altered timeline, she might still live if the confrontation had never reached Winterfell. Arya recalled hearing that, in the frantic efforts to fortify the north, Lyanna had led her men to the last hearth. But she'd never confirmed the girl's fate. Curious, Arya slipped closer to see who had arrived. To her surprise, none other than Lyanna Mormont dismounted from the horse, nearly toppling a stable boy who reached for the reins. Lyanna looked as fierce as ever, her face set in a stern scowl, though there was relief in her eyes as she surveyed Winterfell's walls. She was accompanied by several of her bannermen, all wearing the sigil of the bear. Spotting Arya, she strode over with brisk steps. "Lady Arya," Lyanna said, dipping her head in respect that seemed entirely genuine, though Lyanna was never one to stand on ceremony if she didn't believe it was earned. "I wondered if you'd be here. Word said you might have traveled north, but there's so many tales swirling about these days." She pursed her lips, looking Arya up and down. "You look older, and deadlier." Arya couldn't help a faint smirk. "You've grown a bit yourself." Lyanna was still small, but she carried herself with the authority of a much older person. "You've been away?" Lyanna nodded, gesturing for one of her men to take her gloves. "We were stationed around the last hearth for a time, ensuring the dead truly were gone. We never saw them, only found places they passed before you killed their king. Graves opened, villages emptied. But it was eerily quiet, as though the cold was receding. We came back once we were sure there was no threat." Her gaze flicked around the courtyard. "I hear there's a Targaryen on the throne in the south, and you killed the Lannister queen. Is that right?" Arya shrugged. "Cersei's dead. The rest is up to the historians." Lyanna let out a short, humorless laugh. "Fewer words might be for the best. Bear Island stands with the Starks, though I suppose I should see Lady Sansa. We have supplies, men, and we're ready to do what's needed for the north." Arya inclined her head. "Sansa's in the Great Hall, I imagine. She'll want to welcome you properly." Lyanna made a sound of acknowledgement, then gestured for her men to follow. As she strode off, Arya couldn't help admiring the younger girl's confidence. If only the realm had more leaders like Lyanna Mormont, perhaps they wouldn't have lurched from crisis to crisis. But that was the nature of Westeros, 7 kingdoms, each with its own proud lords and ladies, each desperate to protect or expand their power. Arya felt a pang of restlessness again, the sense that she was merely an observer in a never-ending game. She turned away, heading to the ramparts to clear her mind. She ascended the stone steps 2 at a time, greeting the guards at the top with curt nods. The wind was keener up here, tugging at her hair. She looked out across the wide northern fields. A patchwork of snowdrifts lay in hollows, while the ground itself was half frozen. A line of trees in the distance marked the beginning of the Wolfswood. That forest had once been her playground. She exhaled, letting the chill fill her lungs. She recalled her conversation with Bran. The realm was safe from the dead, but it would never be free of mortal struggles. Below, the courtyard bustled with activity, but it felt almost peaceful. Men carried sacks of grain, stable hands tended to the new arrivals' horses, blacksmiths hammered repairs in the forge. This was Winterfell life, sturdy and determined. She spotted the old archery butts along one wall. Impulsively, she left the ramparts and went down to find a bow. A stable lad pointed her to the armory with wide, reverent eyes. Arya found a suitable bow, tested the tension, and selected a quiver of arrows. She made her way to the butts where a few of the castle guard were practicing. They paused when they saw her, unsure if they should offer her the space. She just nodded, letting them continue. She stood to the side, knocked an arrow, drew back, and loosed. The arrow struck the target near the center, thudding into the straw. It felt good, familiar, a skill honed by countless hours as a child, overshadowed by the memories of more lethal training later. She fired again and again, each arrow finding its mark in a tight grouping. A hush fell among the guards. After her 10th shot, she lowered the bow. She felt calmer, her mind clearer. She continued this routine for a few days. She shared meals with Sansa, updated her on what she had seen in the south, and listened to Winterfell's concerns about forging new alliances. Sansa's perspective was measured. The North still wanted independence, or at least a guarantee of autonomy, yet Jon had bent the knee to Daenerys, and that complicated matters. With the undead gone, the impetus for unity had frayed. Still, Sansa was no fool. She knew the realm had endured countless wars. Perhaps if Daenerys Targaryen was wise enough to grant the North more freedom, they could avoid further conflict. Arya neither encouraged nor discouraged Sansa's opinions. She was not a politician. Sansa was. On the third day since her arrival, a horn blast echoed from the battlements late in the morning. Arya was in the yard again, practicing with a wooden sword against a practice dummy, drawing curious onlookers. She paused mid-swing at the sound. That horn indicated the arrival of a large party at the gates. She leaned her wooden sword against a post and jogged to the front gate, weaving through the throng of castle inhabitants who were equally curious. The portcullis rose, and in rode Jon Snow, flanked by a small retinue of northern knights and a few unsullied outriders wearing Targaryen colors. Jon wore a thick cloak of black fur, Longclaw strapped to his hip. He looked tired, as though the weight of the entire realm rested on his shoulders, but when he spotted Arya in the crowd, his face lit with a genuine smile. He dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy, and strode forward. "Arya," he called, voice echoing off the stone walls. She stepped toward him, feeling a warmth in her chest that she seldom allowed herself to acknowledge. He pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. She returned it briefly, then stepped back. "You've come home," she observed. "Aye," he said, breath fogging in the chilly air. "Finally." He glanced around, relief apparent in his eyes. "Everything looks normal." He almost sounded surprised. Arya understood. After the frantic flight from the Undead, the desperate alliances, and the final war against Cersei, seeing Winterfell in relative peace felt jarring. "Welcome back," she said softly. Jon's retinue dismounted behind him. One of them caught Arya's eye, Grey Worm, the commander of the Unsullied. He surveyed the courtyard with an air of detachment. Arya also recognized a few northern bannermen who had followed Jon south. They looked weary from the journey but glad to be back. Jon motioned for Grey Worm to join him, and the soldier stepped forward with measured discipline. "Lady Arya," Grey Worm said. There was no scorn in his voice, but no warmth either. Merely stoicism. "We've come at the Queen's request. She wants peace in the realm. She knows the North has concerns." Arya tilted her head, curious. "Is Daenerys planning to come herself?" Jon shook his head. "No. She sent Grey Worm as her representative. She's still consolidating her rule in King's Landing. The houses of the Reach and the Stormlands need reassurance. The Crown's finances are in disarray after so many wars. Tyrion is juggling all that. Daenerys wanted me to come home, though, to make sure the North doesn't splinter away now that the existential threat is gone." Arya arched an eyebrow. "So you're here to keep the peace? Or to keep the North in line?" Jon's expression tightened slightly. "To keep the peace. I promise." He looked around. "Where's Sansa?" "Likely in the Great Hall or her solar," Arya answered. "Come on. You know the way." Jon nodded and gestured for Grey Worm to follow him. The rest of the party filed in, while stable hands moved to care for the horses. The courtyard buzzed with excitement. Jon's return was a major event, and the presence of Unsullied again in Winterfell only underscored how precarious these alliances still were. Arya accompanied Jon and Grey Worm up the steps and into the castle's main wing. On the way, Jon gave her a sidelong look. "You've been well?" he asked quietly. She glanced at him. "As well as I can be. I rode north alone, needed some time." She paused, then decided to speak what was on her mind. "Jon, about Daenerys? Do you trust her?" He took a moment to answer. "I do. She saved us. She gave up so much to fight the Night King, even though he never reached us. She lost one of her dragons. Then she fought Cersei. She doesn't want to be her father. She wants to be a just queen. But she also wants her claim acknowledged. That can be hard for Northerners." Arya nodded. "We'll see how Sansa handles it." They reached the Great Hall doors. Guards announced Jon's arrival, and soon Sansa emerged from within, flanked by a pair of attendants. She moved with regal confidence, though her face lit with genuine relief when she saw Jon. She embraced him, though more formally than she would have in private, then welcomed Grey Worm to Winterfell. A round of formalities began, introducing the Northern Lords, discussing travel conditions. Arya stood aside, arms folded, letting them handle it. She saw the wariness in Sansa's eyes when she looked at Grey Worm, but her courtesy never slipped. Before long, Sansa and Jon decided to convene a council meeting. The main lords of the north had been summoned to Winterfell once they heard Jon was returning, so it took only an hour or so for them to gather in the Great Hall. Arya did not particularly want to sit through political negotiations, but she knew it concerned her family. With a sigh, she followed them to the large table near the dais. Lord Serwyn, Manderly, and others took seats, joined by Lady Lyanna Mormont, who had arrived earlier. Grey Worm represented Daenerys, and Jon sat beside Sansa. Arya hovered in the background, quietly observing. Sansa addressed the hall. "We stand at a crossroads. The greatest threat to the living has been vanquished thanks to the bravery of many, especially my sister Arya." She inclined her head toward Arya, who kept her gaze steady but said nothing. "Now, Queen Daenerys Targaryen rules from the Iron Throne, but we must decide how the North fits into this new order." Jon Snow bent the knee to Daenerys out of necessity to unite against the dead. "That threat is gone. Our people demand to know if we remain subject to a southern monarch, or if the North will regain its independence as our forebears once had." A murmur spread through the lords. Arya heard rumblings of support for the idea of an independent North. Others seemed cautious, worried about the potential conflict with Daenerys if they simply declared themselves free. Jon cleared his throat. "I understand your concerns. Daenerys Targaryen does not want to subjugate the North. She wants peace. But she also wants recognition of her birthright to rule the 7 kingdoms, technically the 6 kingdoms if the North seeks to depart. If we choose to separate, it must be done diplomatically with her blessing, or we risk another war." Grey Worm rose to speak. Her Grace, Daenerys Stormborn, is aware of these sentiments. She knows the North has never fully trusted southern rulers, and she does not wish to see more bloodshed. She offers the North semi-autonomous rule under the crown. The Starks would hold full authority over local matters, taxes would be greatly reduced, and the North would only be called upon in times of external threat. But the realm must remain united in name, or else risk fracturing. House Baratheon in the Stormlands, House Tyrell's remnants in the Reach, the Eyrie, Dorne, each might clamor for their own independence if the North breaks away. That would tear the realm apart just as we strive to rebuild it. Arya saw Lyanna Mormont's sharp gaze. The young lady clenched her jaw. The North has bled so often for southern wars. We only bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror after dire circumstances. If Daenerys truly wants peace, perhaps she should let the North go freely and keep the rest of the kingdoms for herself. That remark earned scattered nods from some of the assembled lords. Grey Worm's expression did not change, but his posture grew stiffer. "You suggest the realm be carved apart, with each region going its separate way. The Queen believes that leads to chaos. She is prepared to negotiate, but not to watch the entire realm disintegrate after she has just fought for its survival." Tension simmered in the hall. Sansa glanced at Jon as though to gauge his reaction, then said, "We all want stability. If we remain in the fold, we need firm assurances. If the Iron Throne calls us to war for a southern dispute, the North must have the right to refuse. We will protect the realm from existential threats like the White Walkers, but we will not be pawns in petty power struggles." She paused, letting that sink in. "We also want to ensure that any taxes or demands placed on the North are minimal. Our land is large but harsh. Our people are spread thin, still recovering from years of conflict." Grey Worm nodded, though it was a small, curt gesture. "Those terms, in principle, are acceptable. We can draft an accord. The negotiations content. Yud, with some lords pressing for independence outright, others leaning toward forging a special status under Daenerys' rule." Arya listened without speaking. She felt her chest tighten with the same restlessness. She understood Sansa's position. The North had suffered enough. But she also saw the bigger puzzle that if the realm fractured, new wars might erupt. And she wondered if Daenerys truly had the patience for these negotiations. She had lost a dragon, endured betrayal by Cersei, and fought for a crown that was rightfully hers by blood. Now the North demanded more concessions. It could breed resentment in the future, as so many issues had in Westeros' history. Eventually, the council adjourned for the day. Everyone was exhausted, and Grey Worm asked for time to write to King's Landing for further instruction from Daenerys. Sansa ordered a feast that evening to welcome Jon home and to placate the northern lords who had traveled far. In the great hall that night, the atmosphere was warm but tense. Servants poured ale and mead, while platters of roasted meats and root vegetables circulated among the long tables. Minstrels struck up a tune, though the lords' hushed talk of politics overshadowed the music. Arya sat near the head table, picking at her food. She seldom enjoyed these feasts, feeling out of place among so many stares and hushed whispers about her deeds. Partway through the meal, Jon rose and tapped his cup with a knife. The hall quieted. He cleared his throat. I want to thank all of you for remaining steadfast when I asked you to prepare for war against the dead. None of us could have known how quickly that war would end, thanks to my sister Arya." He turned to Arya, offering a small, respectful bow. Because of her, the Night King was vanquished before he could march on Winterfell. We owe her our lives and the lives of all our children. A roar of agreement went through the hall. Tankards pounded on tables and men raised their voices in cheer. Arya shifted uncomfortably, wanting to shrink back into her seat. She was never one for the limelight. Jon continued, "We also owe gratitude to those who traveled south to face Cersei Lannister. That war ended quickly, sparing the North from further devastation. Now we have decisions to make that will affect our future. But tonight, let us remember we stand together, Starks, Bannermen, allies, all under the same roof. Let us enjoy peace for once in our lives." The cheers grew louder, and the music resumed with renewed vigor. Arya noticed that some of the lords gave her nods of respect or raised their cups in her direction. She forced a tight smile, then busied herself with her cup of ale. After a few moments, Glover, Serwyn, and several others approached to voice their gratitude. She thanked them curtly but tried to deflect any prolonged conversation. Eventually, she managed to slip out of the throng and drift to the shadows near the wall, letting the others celebrate. The great hall reminded her too much of the time she had tried to watch quietly while great men decided the fate of the realm. She was about to leave entirely when Grey Worm unexpectedly approached her. She turned, bracing for a confrontation. He regarded her with the same impassive expression he wore most of the time. "You don't like feasts," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said, studying him. "Neither do you, I imagine." He shook his head. "I am here because my queen commands it. Otherwise, I would be with my soldiers. But I wanted to speak to you." He paused, as though searching for words. "I was told you killed the Night King with a single strike." Arya's mouth thinned. "Yes," he nodded. "In Essos, we told stories of the long night, though we did not believe we would ever face it. Your deed is legendary. Many of my men speak of you with reverence." She arched an eyebrow. "I don't need reverence." "I know," he said simply. "But you have it regardless." Another pause. "I also heard you killed the queen, Cersei Lannister, alone. That is an extraordinary act." Arya let out a small breath. "You want to know why?" Grey Worm shook his head. "No. I wanted to say that your actions may have prevented a greater slaughter. The queen, my queen, was angry after Missandei's capture and execution. If you had not ended Cersei, Daenerys might have felt compelled to burn King's Landing. So you saved many innocents." His eyes flickered with an emotion she could not place, perhaps grief or relief. "I simply wish to acknowledge that." She was taken aback. "Thank you. But I didn't do it for the people. I did it for my family." "Motives seldom matter to the dead who are spared," Grey Worm replied evenly. Then he inclined his head and withdrew, merging back into the crowd, his face returning to its stoic mask. Arya watched him go, unsettled. Part of her had never considered that her private vengeance might have saved thousands of lives. She wondered if that lessened the weight of her guilt or if it merely complicated it. Her entire life had been shaped by a drive to cross names off her list. Now that list was nearly empty, and she was left with the question of who she was without it. The feast continued into the night, but Arya made her way out, slipping into the quiet corridors. She considered returning to her chamber, but her feet carried her elsewhere. She realized she was wandering toward the crypts beneath Winterfell. A guard at the entrance recognized her and let her pass without question. Torch in hand, she descended the spiral steps into the chilled darkness. The flicker of firelight revealed the stone likenesses of ancient Stark lords, each with a dire wolf at their feet. She walked between them, hearing the echo of her footsteps on the cold floor. She stopped at the statue of her father, Ned Stark. The likeness was not perfect, but it captured enough of his noble features to ache in her chest. She remembered him smiling at her, encouraging her to follow her own path. She remembered how he died at Cersei's command, how she'd been forced to watch from the crowd. Now both Cersei and the Night King were dust, and her father's memory lingered in stone. Her torchlight played across the familiar shape of his face. She rested a hand on the statue's cold stone knee, an unsteady breath rattling in her throat. "I did it, father," she whispered. "I avenged you. I saved us from the dead. But I still feel lost." Her words echoed in the crypt. She wondered if he could hear her, if his spirit watched from some corner of the afterlife. "I wish you were here." The silence offered no answer, only the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the crypts. She stood there for a time, letting the hush envelop her. Finally, she turned and made her way back up the steps, her heart heavy. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Grey Worm wrote to King's Landing, detailing the North's demands for near-total autonomy, a mutual defense pact, and minimal taxes or obligations in peacetime. Ravens flew back and forth. A new tension emerged among the northern lords as some whispered that they should proclaim independence outright and dare Daenerys to oppose them. Others, more pragmatic, preferred a negotiated settlement to avoid further conflict. Jon met with each lord or lady, trying to ease their fears and remind them that the Targaryen queen had proven her willingness to sacrifice for the North. Sansa mediated skillfully, using her knowledge of the lords and their grudges to find common ground. Arya observed it all from a remove. Jon confided in Arya one evening by the fire in his solar. "They look to me for guidance, but I'm tired of these battles, whether with swords or words. I never wanted to be king. I wish our father was alive. Or Robb. Or even Rickon, for all the trouble he gave me." He shook his head, shoulders slumped. Arya placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing your best." He sighed. "That might not be enough. Daenerys wants to be the queen of a united Westeros. She's willing to let the North have a special status, but that might set off the other regions. The lords want the North fully independent. A compromise might satisfy no one." Arya studied his face in the flickering firelight. "Do you still love her?" His eyes flicked up, startled. "What?" "Daenerys," Arya said calmly. "When you pledged yourself to her, it wasn't just for the fight against the dead. I saw the way you looked at her. Has that changed?" Jon ran a hand through his hair. It's complicated. With everything that's happened. My true parentage, her quest for the throne. It's strained. But a part of me still admires her, believes in her cause. She's not her father. She wants to free people from tyranny. Yet she also believes the Iron Throne is hers by birthright. Arya gave a small nod. "Birthrights," she muttered. "They've caused a lot of chaos in this realm." Jon smiled wearily. "Yes, they have." He looked at her more intently. "What about you? Are you content here? Or do you plan to leave soon?" She shrugged. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what lies west of Westeros. It's a thought I've had since I was a girl, and it never quite left me." He frowned. "That's uncharted water, Arya. No one knows what's out there." She gave a half-smile. "I've spent my life forging paths no one expected. Why stop now?" He considered her for a moment. "Whatever you do, you'll always have a place here." She nodded, then quietly slipped away, letting him brood over the letters from Daenerys. The negotiation, it turned out, would stretch over several more weeks. Snow drifted down sporadically, hinting that winter had not fully relinquished its hold on the North. Ravens continued to arrive from King's Landing, each letter penned by Tyrion, clarifying terms and proposals. Sansa worked with Jon to draft careful responses. Grey Worm maintained a silent watch, occasionally stepping in to remind them of Daenerys' perspective. At last, they reached a formal agreement. It was read aloud in the Great Hall with all the major lords present. Daenerys would recognize the North's unique status, respecting Stark authority on internal matters, limiting taxes, and refraining from calling northern forces into southern wars except by mutual agreement. In return, the North would acknowledge Daenerys' overlordship and accept the Targaryen monarchy's right to rule the rest of Westeros, offering support if the realm faced external invasion or another existential threat. It was neither total independence nor total fealty, a middle ground hammered out by pragmatic minds who wanted to avoid another war. The tension in the hall as the final words were read was palpable. Some lords looked dissatisfied, but the majority recognized that this compromise was preferable to marching on King's Landing again. When the reading concluded, Sansa placed her seal on the document, and Grey Worm, acting in Daenerys' name, applied the royal dragon seal. A collective sigh of relief shuddered through Winterfell. Jon clasped Grey Worm's forearm in a gesture of respect, and even Lady Mormont, though clearly disappointed, nodded once in acceptance. The realm would not tear itself apart, at least not this month or this season. The The North would have the practical freedom to govern itself, while the Targaryen monarchy remained the official ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. Arya observed the final ceremony from near the dais, arms folded. She saw the subtle lines of exhaustion on Sansa's face, the flicker of frustration in Lyanna Mormont's eyes, and the stoic calm of Grey Worm. She thought of how precarious alliances always were. This one might hold for a generation, or it might collapse in a few years. That was Westeros. Never a truly lasting peace. Over the next few days, Grey Worm made preparations to depart for King's Landing, taking a few northern dignitaries with him. They would present the official accord to Daenerys, forging the next step in a new era. Jon considered returning as well, but Sansa urged him to remain in Winterfell for a time. Our people need to see you here, to trust the leadership we've forged. Send a raven to Daenerys. I'm sure she'll understand. Jon agreed. And so Grey Worm left, taking a small retinue, and the North turned to the more mundane tasks of surviving the tail end of winter. Meanwhile, Arya found herself itching for movement again. The daily business of the castle, grain counts, law disputes, training new guards, did not hold her interest. She sparred occasionally with Brienne in the yard, drawing an audience as their swords clashed in dazzling displays of skill. She roamed the Wolfswood a few times, hunting small game, letting the solitude refresh her. She spent an hour here or there with Bran, who said little but always seemed content in her presence. Yet the thought of what lay beyond the horizon lingered in her mind like a persistent dream. At last, on a mild morning when the sun broke through the gray sky, she sought out Sansa in her solar. Sansa was at her desk, writing letters to lords near the Carhold, instructing them on some matter of roads and taxes. She looked up when Arya entered, setting aside her quill. "Arya, good morning." Arya nodded in greeting, stepping forward. "Sansa, I'm leaving." Sansa's expression tightened, though she'd clearly been expecting this. "Where will you go?" "West," Arya said simply. "I want to see the map's end and keep going." Sansa exhaled, setting her palms flat on the desk. "How soon?" "In a few days. I have to gather supplies, find a ship that will take me from White Harbor, or perhaps from the Sunset Sea if I travel across the north. That part one haven't fully decided. But I am leaving." She let the words hang. "I'm not running from the family. You know that." Sansa's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I know." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "I hoped you might stay longer, but I also knew it was never in your nature to remain. You've always been the wolf that roams." She stepped around the desk, taking Arya's hands in hers. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Arya gave a small nod, feeling the sting of emotion in her chest. "I will. I've survived this long." Sansa's grip tightened. "And if you ever decide to come back, whether it's in a year or 10, Winterfell will be here waiting." Arya blinked away the sudden dampness in her eyes. "Thank you." Sansa leaned in and embraced her, warmth and sorrow mingling. For a moment, they stood in silence, each reflecting on how far they had come. Then Arya stepped back, adjusting the dagger at her hip. "I need to speak with Jon as well." Sansa offered a small, sad smile. "He'll accept it, but it'll hurt him. We've only just got the family back together again." Arya's chest tightened anew. "I know." She found Jon in the courtyard, helping to train a group of new recruits to the Winterfell Guard. His face lit with a grin when he spotted her, and he excused himself from the drill. They strolled along the edge of the yard, where frost still clung to the flagstones. Arya braced herself, finally voicing her intentions. Jon's expression fell, and he was silent for a while. "West of Westeros," he said quietly. "I remember you mentioning that once. I never thought you'd actually do it." Arya shrugged. "It's time. The realm is stable enough for now. The dead are gone. The wars are done. I have no reason to keep my blade here. I want to see what's beyond." He studied her face with a mixture of sadness and pride. "I can't convince you to stay, no more than you could convince a wolf not to howl at the moon." Jon sighed. "I figured. How soon?" "A few days. I'll ride to the coast, then find a ship. Or if I can't find one, I'll buy one." He nodded. "Let me give you some coin and supplies. You've done enough for the realm. We owe you that much." She bristled slightly at the idea of being indebted, but she knew it was practical. "Thank you." He reached out and pulled her into a fierce hug. She let herself rest her chin on his shoulder, inhaling the scent of leather and cold air. "You saved us all," he murmured. "Whatever happens out there, just remember you're a Stark of Winterfell." She closed her eyes. "I'll remember." A tightness constricted her throat. They had been parted so many times, endured so much. Now she was leaving again. But this was different. This time, she chose to leave not out of necessity or vengeance, but because the world was finally open to her. She pulled back, letting the moment settle. That evening, she sought out Gendry in the forges. He was not in Winterfell, of course. He'd remained with Daenerys in King's Landing in the earlier part of the story, but she recalled hearing that the blacksmith's workshop had been set up near the stables for the local men. She found only a group of smiths she didn't recognize. This reminded her that Gendry was far away, forging his own future as the new Lord Baratheon. Perhaps. The realization sent a pang through her heart. Once, she had felt a bond with him that ran deeper than simple friendship. But their paths had diverged. She stood in the door for a moment, letting the heat of the forge wash over her, remembering Gendry's sweat-slick arms as he hammered steel, the glances they had exchanged. Then she turned away, stepping back into the cold, and let that part of her life fade for now. Perhaps one day they would meet again, somewhere in the wide world. Her last few days in Winterfell were spent gathering supplies and exchanging farewells. Sansa arranged for a small chest of gold and silver stags, more than enough to buy a modest ship if she found a willing captain. Arya accepted grudgingly, storing the coins in a discreet pouch. She sharpened her Valyrian dagger to a razor edge, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. She packed a bedroll, a sturdy cloak, and provisions for the journey. Then, on a crisp morning streaked with pale sunlight, she stood in the courtyard with Jon and Sansa, each of them wearing solemn expressions. Bran was there as well, though he lingered off to the side, watching as though from some great distance. "You could come with me," Arya offered him, half-teasing. He gave her the faintest of smiles. "I have too many routes to travel, Arya." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then she turned to Sansa, who clasped her hands. "Take care, little sister." "You too," Arya replied softly. "Keep our home safe." Sansa nodded. "I will." Jon embraced her last, whispering in her ear, "Go, see everything we never imagined. Tell me about it if you ever return." She squeezed his hand and let go, stepping back. Without another word, she led her mare out through the gates. She glanced back once to see them standing there, watching her go. Her family. She etched the image into her mind, then turned away and rode onward. She passed through the town that sprawled outside Winterfell's walls, receiving curious looks from the small folk who had heard rumors of her departure. Once she left the settlement behind, the open road beckoned. She had chosen to ride to White Harbor, the closest major port in the north, to find a ship heading west or south. After that, she wasn't entirely sure. She allowed herself a small, wistful grin. Not knowing was part of the appeal. The journey to White Harbor took the better part of a week, over roads that were frozen in places and bogged in others. She occasionally stayed in small inns, paying with the coin Sansa had given her, or she slept under the stars when she preferred solitude. By day, the countryside was quiet, dotted with farmhouses and patches of evergreen forests. The people here recognized the Stark banner, or at least recognized her face from the swirling tales. Most offered hospitality, but she was polite in turning them down. She needed to remain free of entanglements, to keep her mind on the horizon. At night, she thought of her father's statue in the crypts, of the swirling dust that had been the Night King, of Cersei's final breath. Each memory felt like it belonged to a previous life. She was stepping into something else now. When at last she reached White Harbor, the tall walls and stone towers rose before her, the sigil of House Manderley, a white merman on a teal field, fluttering above the gate. The city bustled with northern merchants, fishermen, and travelers from the south. Arya guided her mare through the streets, absorbing the sights and smells. Salted fish, baking bread, the brine of the harbor. She recalled that this was where Jon had sailed from to meet Daenerys once upon a time, though so much had changed since then. She found a modest stable near the docks to house her horse, paying the stablemaster for a week in advance. She wasn't sure what would become of the mare if she indeed sailed west of Westeros. Perhaps she would leave the horse in the stablemaster's care indefinitely. Time would tell. With her hood drawn up, she made her way to the docks, scanning the ships moored there. The harbor was half frozen, but the Manderley fleet worked to keep channels clear. Vessels from as far as the Vale and the Riverlands bobbed at their piers, delivering goods or collecting shipments of northern timber and hides. Arya wanted something that could survive the open seas and go beyond the usual trade routes. She started asking around, ignoring the startled stares when she inquired about voyages into uncharted waters. Most captains scoffed at the idea. A few laughed outright in her face, telling her that if she wanted to sail west of Westeros, she might as well throw herself into the Sunset Sea and drown. Eventually, she found a weathered old fisherman who claimed to know a captain rumored to be mad enough to consider such a venture. He pointed her to a squat inn by the harbor, naming a man named Morton Pike. She thanked him with a silver stag, and he went away happy. The inn was dimly lit, smelling of stale ale and fish stew. Arya entered, adjusting her dagger so it was visible at her hip, discouraging unwanted attention. She spotted a man with salt and pepper hair sitting at a corner table, nursing a tankard. He wore a faded coat that might once have belonged to a Tyroshi trader, and a battered tricorn hat lay beside him. She approached and asked, "Morton Pike?" He eyed her warily. "Who wants to know?" She pulled back her hood, revealing her face. "I'm Arya Stark. I hear you might be looking to sail into unknown waters." He let out a disbelieving snort. "Arya Stark, is it? Next you'll tell me you're the girl who killed the Night King." She arched an eyebrow. "Yes, that's me. And I'm looking for a ship to take me west of the known world." He stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. She waited, unimpressed, as he shook his head. "Gods, the North is full of crazy tales. If you're truly Arya Stark, show me proof." She shrugged. She didn't carry official documents, but she withdrew a small coin bearing the Stark sigil that Sansa had given her for identification in case she needed to confirm her identity to local officials. She placed it on the table. "There." He picked it up, turned it over, seemed to test the weight. Then he looked at her face again. Slowly, the mirth drained from his features. "You're serious," he muttered. "All right, suppose I believe you. You want to sail west, past the horizon. My crew will say you're mad. And I might agree. I'll pay," she said calmly. "Enough to make it worth your while. I'm told you're not averse to risk." He let out a breath. "I lost half my fortune in a storm near the Summer Isles last year. I'm not sure I'm up to losing the other half trying to cross the Sunset Sea. The old stories say any ship that goes too far west never returns." She leaned forward, unflinching. "Someone has to be the first to come back. And you've got the best chance of any captain here, from what I hear. If it's coin you want, I can pay. If it's not enough, I'll find another who's braver." He eyed her, mind clearly whirling with calculations of profit and danger. At last he spat on the floor. "How much coin?" She named a sum that made his eyes widen. "I can pay half now, half when we reach uncharted waters." He paused, drumming his fingers on the table. Then he jerked his chin. "Let me see the gold." Without hesitation, she laid out the coins that would cover half. She'd brought it in a small pouch from Sansa's chest, anticipating that she might need to show good faith. He stared at the glint of metal. "7 hells," he muttered. "All right, fine. You're paying for the rest of my crew's wages, supplies for a long voyage, and hazard pay. If you still want to do this, meet me in 2 days at Pier 11 with everything you need. My ship is called the Wayward Bride. We'll talk more about our route then." Arya nodded, scooping up the gold. "Agreed." She tossed a couple more coins on the table. "For your drinks and your trouble." He snatched them up greedily. "The Wayward Bride," he repeated. 2 days. She left the inn, heart pounding with a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. She had done it. She had found a ship willing to take her beyond the known edges of the map. She spent the next 2 days purchasing additional supplies. Dried foods, a good cloak suited for sea travel, sturdy boots, and various bits of gear. She also penned a short letter to Sansa, explaining that she had found a ship in White Harbor and was departing. She assured her sister she would be safe as one could be on an uncharted voyage. Then she paid a local messenger to carry the letter back to Winterfell. On the appointed morning, the docks were bathed in pale, cold sunlight. The wayward bride looked a bit worse for wear, but it had tall masts and a reinforced hull that suggested some experience in rough waters. Morden Pike stood on the pier, shouting orders to his crew as they loaded barrels and crates. He spotted Arya approaching, a rucksack slung over her shoulder. She wore leathers under her cloak, dagger at her hip. Her breath misted in the cool air. "Stow your gear below," he barked, gesturing to a lanky deckhand. "Have him show you where you can berth. Don't expect comfort. We're a merchant vessel, not a pleasure craft." "I'm not here for comfort," Arya replied. She stepped aboard, the deck shifting beneath her feet. She inhaled the scent of tar and salt. The crew gave her curious looks, some tipping their heads, others scowling as if to say, "This is madness." Arya ignored them. She found a small corner in the cramped berth, stowed her belongings, and returned topside. The lines were cast off, sails unfurled, and the ship slowly pulled away from the pier, drifting into the harbor's channel. As the city's walls receded, Arya felt her heart flutter. She was really doing this, leaving Westeros behind, possibly for good. They navigated the ice-flecked waters, passing out of the harbor and into open sea. The wind caught the sails, the hull groaned, and soon the wayward bride was slicing through the waves. Arya stood near the bow, gazing ahead, the sunlight glinting on the water. Behind her, the landmass of Westeros stretched out, a place of old heartbreak and new beginnings, of wars and alliances, of the family she loved and the enemies she had slain. She thought of Jon, Sansa, Bran, and the memory of her parents. She thought of the Night King dissolving into shards. She thought of Cersei's final breath. She thought of how, for the first time in years, she was doing something that was entirely her own choice, unbound by vengeance or duty. The horizon beckoned, endless and unknown. She felt the sea breeze whip her hair around her face. Closing her eyes, she whispered under her breath, "I am Arya Stark of Winterfell, and I'm going west." The ship rocked beneath her, carrying her ever forward. She kept her eyes on that far line where sky met sea, where no map could guide her. Here, beyond the known, she might finally discover who she was without a list of names, without a war to fight. She was not no one, she was simply Arya, a quiet wolf on the cusp of a new world. And with that realization brimming in her chest, she smiled into the wind, letting it fill her lungs with the promise of freedom, knowing that whatever awaited her beyond Westeros was hers to find.